Welcome, and thank you for settling in tonight. I invite you to take a slow breath, feel the weight of your day gently ease away, and allow yourself to drift into the soft rhythm of history. Tonight, we will journey together through distant lands and times long past, following the path of men and women whose stories still echo across centuries. Our tale begins far to the north, in lands where the winter wind whistles through fjords and the long nights are illuminated by the dance of the northern lights. This is the story of the Vikings and the way they moved across Europe, leaving behind whispers of adventure, fear, and discovery. Long ago, in the early 8th century, the Scandinavian landscape was a mixture of forests, rolling hills, and jagged coastlines, punctuated by the deep blue of rivers and the vast expanse of the sea. In this world, small communities lived off the land, tending to livestock and crops, hunting in the dense woods, and fishing in the icy waters. Life was hard, shaped by the harsh climate and the rhythm of the seasons, but it was also rich in stories, songs, and a deep sense of family and loyalty. These communities were not isolated despite the rugged terrain. They were bound together by kinship, trade, and a shared belief in gods who governed the skies, the seas, and the unseen forces of life. The Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, and many others, were ever present in daily life, guiding the brave, punishing the foolish, and inspiring both awe and fear. As the centuries passed, the people of these northern lands developed a reputation that would one day reach far beyond their fjords and forests. They became known as seafarers, skilled not only in building boats that could withstand treacherous waters, but in navigating rivers and coasts with remarkable precision. Their longships, slender and swift, could glide silently through calm waters or surge through the waves with formidable speed, capable of carrying warriors across hundreds of miles in a matter of days. It was these ships, more than anything else, that would make the Vikings a force that Europe could neither ignore nor fully understand. The first recorded raids of these northern warriors began quietly, almost unremarkably, along the coastlines and rivers of what is now England and France. In 793, a shock swept through the monastery at Lindisfarne, a small island off the northeast coast of England. Monks who had spent their lives in prayer and study were confronted with the terrifying arrival of seafaring warriors, their shields glinting in the sun, axes raised, eyes hard with purpose. The attack was swift and merciless. The monastery, a center of learning, art, and religion, was pillaged, its treasures stolen, its people slaughtered or carried away. This event, though one among many violent incidents of the era, was recorded in such a way that it became a symbol of the beginning of a new chapter in European history. It is important to understand that the Vikings were not merely raiders. Their motivations were complex, shaped by economics, politics, and the seasons themselves. The long winters of Scandinavia, when the land offered little in the way of sustenance, often forced the northern peoples to look beyond their homelands for food and resources. Political disputes between local chieftains could also drive groups to seek glory and wealth elsewhere. And yet, there was an undeniable element of adventure in these early journeys. The sea offered not only danger but possibility, a horizon that promised new lands, new people, and new stories. As the years progressed, the raids grew more frequent and more organized. Viking bands traveled not only to England and Ireland, but further south to the coasts of modern-day France, Spain, and even Italy. They were meticulous in their planning, understanding tides, seasons, and the vulnerabilities of the settlements they intended to strike. In some regions, towns and monasteries learned to anticipate these attacks, erecting fortifications and raising alarm systems. In others, communities fell swiftly, unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the longships, appearing almost like shadows from the mist. The raids themselves were dramatic yet often brief. Vikings struck quickly, taking what they needed and disappearing just as swiftly as they had arrived. They carried with them the spoils of their victories, treasures of gold, silver, and objects of religious significance, which they brought back to their homelands. These items were not only symbols of wealth, but of prestige and power. A chieftain who returned from a successful raid with such riches gained influence and respect among his peers. The act of raiding was therefore entwined with the social fabric of Scandinavian society, as much a matter of survival and strategy as of honor and reputation. Yet, there was more to the Vikings than conquest. Alongside the fearsome raiders were settlers, traders and explorers. The rivers of Europe became highways, and through them, the Vikings established new settlements that blended with local cultures. In England, areas such as the Danelaw emerged, where Scandinavian law, language, and customs mingled with the traditions of the Anglo-Saxons. In what is now France, the region that would become Normandy saw the arrival of Viking leaders who were granted land in exchange for loyalty and protection against other invaders. These settlements demonstrate that the Vikings were not only agents of destruction, but also catalysts for cultural exchange and transformation, leaving a legacy that would endure long after the swords were sheathed. In Scandinavia itself, life continued in its cycles of hardship and celebration. Families maintained farms, crafted tools, and told stories that celebrated their heroes and warned of the wrath of gods and spirits. The sagas, written centuries later, would preserve these tales in vivid detail, capturing the imagination of generations far beyond the fjords and forests. Through these stories, the deeds of men and women who voyaged across stormy seas, fought in battles, and sought both wealth and honor were immortalized, blending history with legend in a tapestry that continues to fascinate today. The interaction between Vikings and the wider world was complex. While Europe often remembered them for the fear and destruction they brought, there were also moments of diplomacy, alliance, and trade. Coastal towns learned to negotiate with Viking leaders, offering tribute or entering into agreements that could prevent raids. Norse traders carried goods not only from the north, but from the east and west, connecting regions in ways that would lay the groundwork for economic networks that stretched across the continent. The exchange of goods, ideas, and even religion played a subtle but important role in the shaping of medieval Europe. As the Viking era matured, so too did the sophistication of their raids. They began to target inland settlements with greater precision, navigating rivers such as the Seine, the Rhine, and the Volga to reach towns that had never before encountered the northern warriors. The sight of longships moving silently along a river, their sails like dark wings against the horizon, became a harbinger of both terror and fascination. Chroniclers of the time, often monks and scribes, recorded these events with a mixture of horror and awe, describing the Vikings as both ruthless and extraordinary, outsiders who challenged the established order yet left an indelible mark on it. Even as their raids grew in fame and intensity, the Vikings themselves remained deeply tied to the rhythms of their homeland. The harsh Scandinavian winters, the long summer days, and the cycles of farming and hunting continued to shape their lives. Stories of gods and heroes, of sea monsters and enchanted lands, were woven into the fabric of their daily existence. These beliefs provided courage for those who sailed into the unknown, comfort for those who stayed behind, and a lens through which all experiences, victory, loss, or simple survival, were interpreted. By the 10th century, the reach of the Vikings had extended to almost every corner of Europe. From the coasts of Britain and Ireland to the rivers of Russia, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the distant islands of the North Atlantic, they left traces of their presence. Some traces were violent, in the form of burned villages and plundered treasures. Others were subtle, in the mingling of language, art, and customs. In each case, the Vikings shaped the societies they touched, for better or worse, leaving a legacy that was both feared and respected. The story of the Vikings is not simply one of raids and battles, it is also a story of adaptation, exploration, and resilience. They faced the uncertainty of the sea, the challenge of foreign lands, and the unpredictable nature of both human and divine forces. Their ability to navigate these challenges, to survive and thrive, offers a window into a world that was at once harsh and beautiful, perilous and full of opportunity. As we follow their journey, it is easy to imagine the rhythmic sound of oars dipping into the water, the creak of wooden hulls, the distant cry of a lookout spotting land on the horizon. It is easy to imagine the anticipation and tension as warriors prepared to disembark, the silence before a raid, and the stories that would be told by survivors and descendants alike. Through these images, we come closer to understanding the complexity of Viking life, not as mere raiders, but as people navigating a vast, interconnected, and often unforgiving world. The legacy of these northern travelers is preserved in many forms. Archaeological discoveries reveal the sophistication of their craftsmanship, from finely constructed ships to intricately designed jewelry and tools. Written records, while often colored by fear and bias, provide glimpses of the interactions between Vikings and the peoples of Europe, and the stories passed down through generations, whether in the form of sagas, myths, or oral histories, continue to captivate and inform, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. Even as centuries passed and the Viking Age drew to a close, the influence of these seafarers endured. The regions they once raided or settled evolved, blending local traditions with those brought by the Norse. Cities grew, trade expanded, and the memory of the Vikings transformed from one of terror to one of fascination and respect. Historians, storytellers, and artists continue to explore this era, uncovering new insights and imagining the lives of those who lived at the edge of the known world, guided by courage, curiosity, and the restless call of the sea. As the night deepens and you listen, it becomes possible to picture the northern shores under a quiet moon, longships gliding silently through the fjords, and distant villages where families gather around fires, telling stories that stretch back through generations. This is the world the Vikings inhabited, a world of extremes, where beauty and danger existed side by side, and where the choices of a few could echo across continents and centuries. As the 9th century unfolded, the pattern of Viking activity across Europe became more defined. The earliest raids, such as the attack on Lindisfarne in 793, were relatively isolated events. At first, these northern seafarers struck monasteries and small coastal settlements, places that were rich in goods but poorly defended. Monasteries in particular were frequent targets, not only because they held valuable objects made of gold and silver, but also because they offered minimal resistance. Many of these sites had walls that were low and weak, sometimes no more than wooden palisades or small stone barriers. The monks themselves, dedicated to prayer and study, had little experience or training in military defense. Over time, the Vikings began to plan their raids with more precision. They learned to time their movements with the tides, to hide their ships in inlets and behind islands, and to navigate rivers that penetrated far inland. In England, for example, they moved along the rivers that flowed from the east coast, reaching towns that were never expecting an attack. York, which would later become an important centre of Viking settlement, experienced repeated incursions as a result of its strategic location along the Ouse River. These early raids were not only opportunistic, but increasingly methodical, aimed at both immediate gain and establishing long-term influence in certain regions. In Ireland, the Vikings found a land that was divided into numerous small kingdoms, each ruled by its own king or chieftain. These divisions made the islands particularly vulnerable. The first recorded Viking attacks in Ireland occurred around the 830s, with raids on monasteries such as those at Lambay Island and Skellig Michael. The monasteries often contained manuscripts, relics, and other valuable items, making them appealing targets. The Vikings did not attempt to settle permanently at first. They came, took what they wanted, and returned north. However, over time, some groups began to establish more lasting presences in Ireland, particularly in coastal towns like Dublin, which would eventually grow into a major Viking settlement. In what is now France, Viking activity increased in the 9th century, focusing largely on the regions along the Seine, Loire, and Garonne rivers. Coastal settlements such as Rouen and Nantes were vulnerable, because their access by river allowed the Vikings to approach without being detected from inland. The Carolingian kings of the time struggled to respond effectively. Many of their armies were local militias that could be raised quickly, but were not trained for sustained campaigns against highly mobile raiders. As a result, Vikings were able to strike repeatedly, often retreating before a significant defensive force could be organized. The tactics of the Vikings relied on speed and surprise. Longships allowed them to land swiftly, unload men and supplies, and strike settlements before the inhabitants could prepare. Once the raid was completed, the ships could carry the raiders back to Scandinavia or to other parts of Europe. This mobility was one of their greatest advantages. Unlike armies tied to the land, Vikings could move along rivers, across coasts, and even over shallow inland waters that were inaccessible to heavier, slower vessels. This flexibility made it difficult for local populations to anticipate where or when an attack would occur. The consequences of these raids varied widely. In some cases, towns and monasteries were destroyed or severely damaged. In others, the Vikings took goods and returned home without causing lasting physical destruction. The psychological impact, however, was often greater than the material one. Reports from monks and scribes describe fear, panic, and uncertainty that spread through communities. The sudden arrival of a longship on a calm river could disrupt the lives of entire villages, creating an awareness that danger could appear at any time from places that were once considered safe. By the mid-9th century, Viking activity began to include more organized settlement. This was particularly evident in what is now Normandy in northern France. In 911, a treaty was reached between the Viking leader Rollo and the Frankish King Charles the Simple. Rollo was granted land in exchange for pledging loyalty to the king and providing military support against other raiders. The territory, known as the Duchy of Normandy, became a permanent Viking settlement. Over time, the Norse settlers adopted local customs, converted to Christianity, and integrated into the existing social and political structures, blending Scandinavian and Frankish traditions. England saw a similar development, particularly in the area known as the Danelaw. This region, encompassing parts of modern-day eastern and northern England, came under the control of Danish Vikings. They established towns, traded with local populations, and applied their own laws and customs alongside those of the Anglo-Saxons. The presence of these settlers led to a period of both conflict and cooperation. Battles occurred, but trade and alliances also took place. Over time, the cultural influence of the Vikings became deeply embedded in the local language, law, and place names, leaving traces that persist to this day. In addition to raiding and settlement, the Vikings engaged in trade across Europe. Their longships enabled not only military expeditions, but the movement of goods over large distances. From Scandinavia, they brought furs, timber, and iron, exchanging these for silver, spices, wine, and other commodities from continental Europe. Markets in towns along rivers and coasts became hubs for this activity, allowing for sustained economic connections between northern Europe and the rest of the continent. In this way, the Vikings contributed to the expansion of trade networks linking regions that might otherwise have remained isolated. The rivers of Eastern Europe, particularly the Volga and the Dnieper, were key routes for Viking expansion in that direction. Groups known as the Varangians traveled southward into the territories that would become modern Russia and Ukraine. They established trade centers, sometimes interacting with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates to the south. The route from the Baltic to the Black Sea enabled the movement of silver, silk, and other valuable goods. Along these rivers, Vikings occasionally established settlements blending with local Slavic populations and leaving behind both material and cultural legacies. Although much of the historical record emphasizes Viking violence, it is also clear that they operated within social, political, and economic structures. In Scandinavia, loyalty to local chieftains, adherence to kinship networks, and the accumulation of wealth and reputation were central to their society. Successful raids enhanced a leader's standing, while failure could result in loss of influence or conflict within the group. Women, too, played important roles in maintaining households, managing farms, and even participating in trade or travel. This social context helps explain the complex motivations behind Viking activity beyond simple plundering. The ships themselves were a crucial factor in Viking success. Longships were designed with both shallow and deep draft capabilities, enabling travel across rivers, fjords, and open seas. They were flexible, fast, and capable of carrying dozens of warriors along with their supplies. The construction of these ships required knowledge of timber, tools, and techniques that allowed them to withstand rough northern waters. Beyond military utility, they facilitated communication and trade, connecting distant settlements and enabling movement across vast regions. The evolution of Viking tactics over time reflected their growing understanding of European defenses. Early raids were often direct and violent, aimed at the most vulnerable targets. Later campaigns involved reconnaissance, strategic alliances, and careful timing to exploit weaknesses in local defenses. In some regions, Vikings would overwinter, using fortified camps along rivers as bases for further incursions. These developments show a level of planning and adaptation that goes beyond the image of simple marauders, revealing a society capable of strategic decision-making and long-term objectives. As the 10th century approached, Viking influence began to change. In many regions, local populations became more adept at resisting attacks. Fortifications were strengthened, militias were trained, and warning systems were improved. At the same time, Vikings increasingly shifted from raiding toward trade and settlement, integrating more deeply with European societies. The establishment of towns under Viking control, the negotiation of treaties, and the adoption of local customs and religions reflected this gradual transformation. The cultural impact of these interactions was significant. In England, Norse words entered the local language, influencing vocabulary and place names. In Ireland, towns such as Dublin and Waterford became centres of trade and administration under Viking oversight. In Normandy, Scandinavian settlers merged with the local population, creating a hybrid culture that would play a role in European history for centuries to come. Across Europe, the Viking presence reshaped both the physical landscape and the social environment, leaving traces in law, architecture, and everyday life. Even as their activities evolved, the image of the Vikings as raiders remained prominent in contemporary accounts. Chronicles from monasteries and towns describe attacks with vivid detail, often emphasizing the speed and brutality of the assaults. These accounts, while sometimes exaggerated, provide important historical evidence for the nature of Viking raids. They reveal patterns of movement, types of targets, and the impact on local populations. Combined with archaeological evidence, such records help construct a clearer picture of the Viking era, balancing fearsome reputation with evidence of settlement, trade, and adaptation. By the 10th century, Viking activity had become more varied. They no longer limited themselves to coastal raids, but extended deeper into the continent, using rivers and overland routes to reach areas that were previously untouched. In England, this period saw repeated campaigns by Danish Vikings, who at times established temporary bases from which they could strike inland. The Kingdom of Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred the Great, responded with a combination of military organization and negotiation. Alfred encouraged the construction of fortified towns, or burhs, which served as centers of defense and safe havens for the local population. These burhs were strategically located to protect the most vulnerable areas, often near rivers or major roads. enabling rapid communication and mobilization of forces. The development of these fortifications significantly reduced the effectiveness of Viking raids. While longships could still move quickly along rivers, the presence of fortified towns meant that raiders faced resistance wherever they attempted to settle or plunder. Alfred also established a system of local militias known as fyrds, which could be called upon to respond to threats. These measures reflected a growing sophistication in the defense of European territories against Viking incursions. In Ireland, Viking settlements became more permanent during this period. Towns such as Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick evolved from temporary raiding camps into structured urban centres. These towns facilitated trade both within Ireland and with foreign regions, particularly the Viking homelands in Scandinavia. The settlers maintained connections with their northern origins, while integrating into the local social and economic systems. Marriages between Norse and Irish families occurred, producing generations who were both culturally and linguistically blended. Over time, this integration diminished the purely raiding nature of Viking activity in Ireland, shifting toward commerce and settlement. The Vikings in France also experienced transformation. The earlier raids along the Seine and Loire had instilled fear in the local population, but by the 10th century, the establishment of the Duchy of Normandy created a more stable structure. Viking leaders who settled there adopted many local customs, including feudal systems, and pledged loyalty to the Frankish kings. They converted to Christianity, sometimes under pressure, and participated in local governance. This integration into the feudal system marked a shift from raider to ruler, demonstrating that the Vikings could adapt to political and social realities beyond their homelands. Trade remained a central aspect of Viking activity throughout this period. The rivers of Europe, including the Rhine, the Seine, and the Volga, acted as highways for the movement of goods. Vikings transported furs, honey, timber, and iron from Scandinavia, exchanging them for silver, salt, wine, and other commodities from Europe and beyond. Markets in towns along rivers became hubs of economic activity, and Viking traders played a role in the expansion of these networks. The movement of silver, in particular, became a hallmark of Viking commerce. Coins from distant regions, including the Islamic world, have been discovered in Scandinavian settlements, illustrating the reach and interconnectedness of Viking trade networks. In Eastern Europe, Viking activity took a slightly different form. Groups known as the Varangians traveled southward along the rivers that connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They established trade centers and occasional fortified settlements, which enabled interactions with the Byzantine Empire and Islamic states. The route from the Baltic to the Black Sea was particularly important for the transport of silver, silk, and other luxury goods. Along these rivers, Vikings sometimes served as mercenaries or engaged in political alliances with local rulers, demonstrating that their influence extended beyond raiding and settlement into diplomacy and military service. By the 10th century, Viking society had also developed further internally. Chieftains and kings relied on a combination of loyalty, reputation, and wealth to maintain their positions. Raiding remained an important way to gain both material wealth and social standing, but trade, settlement, and strategic marriages were equally significant. Women continued to play important roles in the management of households and resources. Some women are believed to have managed farms and trading activities in the absence of men who were away on raids or expeditions. These roles contributed to the resilience of Viking communities and their ability to maintain long-distance connections. The ships themselves were continuously refined during this era. Longships remained the principal vessels for raids, but some groups also constructed larger vessels suitable for transporting greater quantities of goods or people. The design of these ships allowed them to navigate both shallow rivers and open seas, giving the Vikings an unmatched mobility. The combination of speed, versatility, and durability made these ships a cornerstone of Viking influence. Beyond their utility in raids, they enabled long-distance trade, exploration, and communication between settlements, ensuring that the Vikings remained connected across Europe. Viking raids in the Mediterranean were less common but notable. Groups traveled along the coasts of Spain and Italy, attacking towns and ports that were largely unprepared for northern invaders. These raids were smaller in scale compared to those in the north, but demonstrated the wide reach of Viking activity. The Mediterranean provided both opportunity and challenge. It offered wealth and trade potential, but also exposed the raiders to different climates, diseases, and unfamiliar terrain. Despite these challenges, occasional expeditions illustrate the adaptability and ambition of Viking society. Conflict between Vikings and European kingdoms continued to shape both sides. In England, repeated incursions prompted the unification of regional kingdoms under strong rulers capable of organizing effective resistance. The battle strategies employed by both sides evolved over time. Viking raiders relied on surprise, speed, and knowledge of local geography, while defenders strengthened fortifications, trained militias, and developed early warning systems. These interactions resulted in a cycle of adaptation, with each side learning from the other and gradually increasing the complexity of military engagements. In Scotland and the Northern Islands, Vikings established settlements that became centres of political and economic activity. The Orkney and Shetland Islands, along with parts of the Scottish mainland, came under the influence of Norse leaders. These settlements facilitated control of sea routes, trade, and resources. Local populations were sometimes displaced, and Norse law and customs were introduced. The integration of Viking settlers into these regions created hybrid communities that combined Scandinavian and local elements. Over time, these areas became distinct cultural zones influenced by both Viking and indigenous practices. Religion played a significant role in the integration of Viking settlers. Initially, the Norse maintained their own pantheon, worshipping gods such as Odin, Thor, and Freya. Religious practices included sacrifices, rituals, and storytelling that reinforced social cohesion and conveyed cultural values. Over time, as Vikings settled in Christian regions of Europe, they converted to Christianity, often gradually. Conversion brought access to political alliances, integration into local society, and acceptance in communities that were previously hostile. Churches and monasteries were no longer merely targets but centers of participation in the social and economic life of the settlers. The social and political structures of Viking society supported both raiding and settlement. Leadership depended on wealth, loyalty, and military success, and social mobility was possible through achievement in these areas. Raiding enhanced reputation and provided material rewards, while trade, marriage alliances, and political negotiation could secure long-term stability. Communities were organized around kinship and local governance, which allowed for coordinated responses to challenges and opportunities. These structures contributed to the ability of the Vikings to maintain influence across a wide geographic area. As the 10th century progressed, Viking activity continued to evolve. The distinction between raider and settler became less pronounced as more permanent settlements were established. Trade networks expanded, and connections between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe became increasingly complex. Some areas experienced repeated conflict, while others became centers of commerce and cultural exchange. This period of transformation laid the groundwork for the eventual decline of large-scale Viking raiding and the consolidation of their presence within European societies. Even with these changes, the image of the Vikings as raiders remained prominent in European memory. Chronicles and annals recorded attacks with detailed descriptions of the speed, violence, and surprise of Viking incursions. These accounts highlight the continuing importance of mobility and strategy in Viking operations. At the same time, archaeological evidence demonstrates that settlement, trade, and cultural integration were equally important aspects of Viking influence. Together, these sources provide a balanced understanding of the era, showing both the fearsome reputation and the lasting contributions of the Vikings. As the 11th century approached, the pattern of Viking activity in Europe shifted noticeably. The initial intensity of sudden strikes and coastal plundering had given way to a more deliberate approach, blending settlement, trade, and occasional military expeditions. Scandinavian groups increasingly sought to integrate into local power structures, taking advantage of political instability, economic opportunity, and the connections provided by their mobility along waterways. In England, the descendants of earlier raiders were often fully established as landholders, controlling territories that had once been vulnerable to attack. These communities maintained their ties to Northern Europe, but their primary focus shifted from raiding to sustaining settlements and managing estates. Local populations, once entirely defensive, began to interact with these newcomers in more regular ways through trade, service, and mutual defense arrangements. Viking influence on the legal systems, place names, and everyday customs became gradually more visible, blending into the broader Anglo-Saxon society. Scotland and the surrounding islands continued to experience Scandinavian presence, but the nature of control evolved over generations. Norse families who had established themselves in Orkney, Shetland, and parts of the western mainland engaged with local rulers, often negotiating rights to resources or forming alliances for mutual protection. Fishing, herding, and coastal trade became increasingly central to daily life, and Scandinavian settlers adopted certain local practices while retaining aspects of their northern heritage. By the 11th century, a new social fabric had emerged, incorporating elements from both Norse and indigenous traditions. Ireland also reflected a similar transition. Towns that had begun as temporary raiding bases, Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, were now permanent settlements with well-defined administrative systems. Viking leaders served as local authorities, overseeing trade, taxation, and defense. The interaction with native Irish populations included both conflict and collaboration. Intermarriage and social integration created a population that was culturally hybrid, blending language, law, and religious practices. By this period, the distinction between Scandinavian invader and local resident had become less pronounced, as generations of children were born into communities that were neither fully Norse nor entirely Irish. France, particularly Normandy, demonstrated a striking example of integration. Descendants of early raiders had fully adopted Christian faith, and the feudal system, managing lands, collecting rents, and participating in regional politics. Norman leaders, though originally of Scandinavian origin, became influential figures in the broader European landscape. Their capacity to combine military skill with administrative competence allowed them to maintain control over territories while contributing to the social and political stability of the region. Normandy would later serve as a base for further expansion, including ventures that reached England in the later 11th century. Viking engagement with trade remained extensive. Northern communities moved goods along rivers and coasts, connecting Scandinavia with continental Europe and beyond. Timber, amber, furs, and metals traveled southward, while silver, wine, salt, and luxury items were brought north. Eastern trade routes to the Black Sea and the Caspian facilitated the exchange of silver coins and textiles from far-off regions. The Varangians, traveling through what is now Russia and Ukraine, continued to establish nodes of commerce, often acting as intermediaries between local populations and distant empires. This system of exchange underpinned economic development and allowed Viking communities to accumulate wealth without relying solely on raiding. Militarily, the 11th century saw further adaptation. Longships remained central to mobility, but land-based fortifications and the formation of professional militias had altered the balance of power in many regions. In England, the Witan, a council of nobles and advisors, coordinated defences and negotiated terms with Scandinavian leaders. In Ireland and Scotland, local chieftains organised patrols along rivers and coasts to intercept raiders. Even where Viking groups retained martial capability, they increasingly combined military activity with diplomacy and economic engagement, using their strength as leverage in negotiations rather than as the sole means of acquiring resources. Religion had become a significant factor in the relationships between Vikings and local populations. By the 11th century, conversion to Christianity was widespread among Scandinavian settlers. Churches and monasteries were no longer merely targets of raids. They became focal points of community life, centers for education, and hubs for administration. The adoption of Christian rites, observance of festivals, and participation in ecclesiastical governance allowed former raiders to consolidate authority and gain legitimacy in regions where religious alignment was politically important. Throughout this period, the social structure of Scandinavian communities reflected both continuity and change. Loyalty to local leaders, the importance of kinship networks, and the accumulation of personal wealth remained central. However, as raiding became less dominant, trade, land management, and political alliances increasingly determined status. Reputation was still crucial, but it could now be earned through leadership in settlement administration, negotiation with neighboring powers, or success in commercial ventures. Viking society had evolved from a largely itinerant, opportunistic culture to one capable of sustaining long-term influence across multiple regions. In Eastern Europe, Viking expansion along river routes continued to shape local development. Settlements along the Dnieper and Volga allowed for commerce with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. These interactions were not limited to trade. Vikings served as mercenaries, diplomats, and occasionally administrators. The establishment of fortified towns and market centers created enduring nodes of influence, connecting the north to the wider medieval world. By the 11th century, these networks were well established, enabling a flow of goods, information, and people over distances that had previously been difficult to traverse. As generations passed, Viking influence became deeply woven into the societies they had once raided. In England, place names derived from Old Norse persisted, indicating areas of settlement and cultural impact. In Ireland, Scandinavian terminology influenced trade, navigation, and urban administration. In Normandy, architecture, military organization, and legal customs reflected a synthesis of Norse and local traditions. Even in regions where Scandinavian military presence faded, the legacy of their interactions, through commerce, settlement, and cultural exchange, remained significant. By the mid-11th century, the era of large-scale Viking raids was drawing to a close. Political consolidation in England, France, and other regions, along with improved fortifications and local military organization, reduced the viability of sudden coastal and river attacks. Scandinavian leaders increasingly relied on trade, taxation, and local alliances to maintain wealth and influence. Settlements became urban centers, towns developed administrative structures, and former raiding networks transformed into commercial and political networks. The shift from raiding to governance illustrates a gradual transition from external threat to internal integration. Despite this change, the Viking legacy continued to be remembered in the collective memory of Europe. Chronicles and annals recorded raids with precise dates and locations, providing detailed evidence of both the speed and extent of Viking activity. Archaeological discoveries, including tools, coins, and everyday objects, offer tangible proof of Scandinavian presence across Europe. Linguistic traces, place names, and legal practices reveal cultural influence that persisted long after the last raiding expeditions had ceased. The enduring impact of the Vikings was not limited to destruction. It was reflected in the social, economic, and political transformation of the regions they had once unsettled. In Scandinavia, The 11th century also marked a period of stabilization. Communities that had once relied heavily on seasonal raiding increasingly focused on agriculture, local trade, and the development of settlements. Leadership structures became more formalized, with kings and chieftains consolidating power over larger territories. The role of women remained significant, managing estates, maintaining economic activity, and contributing to social cohesion. Over time, Scandinavian society became less outwardly aggressive, even as its connections to distant lands continued through trade, marriage alliances, and cultural exchange. By the later 11th century, the Vikings had established a recognizable pattern across Europe. Their early raids had evolved into permanent settlements, trading networks, and integration with local political systems. Coastal and riverine defenses were strengthened, urban centers had developed, and local populations had adapted to centuries of interaction with northern communities. The transformation of Viking activity illustrates a gradual shift from opportunistic raiding to sustained influence, demonstrating the adaptability and resilience of Scandinavian societies. Even as the Viking Age waned, its imprint remained visible across the continent. The administrative, economic, and cultural contributions of Scandinavian settlers influenced subsequent generations. Regions such as Normandy would later play decisive roles in European history, while in England, Irish coastal towns, and the northern British Isles, Norse heritage continued to shape urban development, language, and social structures. Trade networks established by the Vikings persisted, providing connections that would support later commerce and communication. The legacy of the Vikings is therefore both immediate and enduring. The initial raids, dramatic and sudden, captured attention and inspired fear. The settlements that followed, more gradual and structured, reshaped local societies over decades. Trade networks and political alliances extended Scandinavian influence far beyond the borders of the homeland. By integrating with the communities they encountered, Vikings left an imprint that blended violence, diplomacy, commerce, and culture, creating a historical footprint that would continue to be traced in the centuries that followed. By the late 11th century, the pattern of Viking activity had become remarkably different from the violent raids of earlier centuries. The Scandinavian presence in Europe was now largely established through settlement, trade, and political integration rather than sudden plundering. Communities founded by Norse families had matured into towns and regions with well-defined administrative systems. Coastal towns along the British Isles, Ireland, and northern France no longer feared the unpredictable arrival of longships as much as they had in centuries past. Instead, they interacted with Scandinavian settlers as neighbors, trading partners, and sometimes rulers. In England, the descendants of Danish settlers had become an integral part of local governance. The territories, once under the influence of the Danelaw, were fully incorporated into the kingdom, blending Scandinavian customs with Anglo-Saxon law. Towns that had served as bases for raiding now functioned as centers of commerce and civic administration. Vikings were no longer primarily seen as invaders, but as part of the social and economic fabric of the region. Their maritime expertise remained a valuable asset, contributing to trade, transportation, and military readiness. But it was employed within more structured political contexts. Scotland and the surrounding islands continued to reflect Norse settlement patterns. In the Orkney and Shetland Islands, local chieftains of Scandinavian descent maintained influence over land and maritime routes. Coastal communities relied on fishing, herding, and small-scale trade for sustenance and economic growth. Over generations, cultural blending occurred, with Norse traditions merging with those of indigenous populations. By this time, the identification of people as Viking had become more a marker of heritage than of active raiding, reflecting a slow transition from a society of seasonal expeditions to one of permanent residence. Ireland retained a distinctive hybrid culture where Scandinavian settlers had established lasting urban centres. Cities such as Dublin, Cork, Limerick, and Waterford developed into important hubs of trade, political authority, and cultural life. Vikings in Ireland participated in local governance, collected tolls or taxes, and contributed to the defense of the settlements they controlled. Their descendants were fully integrated into Irish society, combining Norse and Gaelic practices. Maritime trade remained a primary focus, linking Irish ports to both Scandinavia and other European centres. Over time, these settlements became vital nodes in regional economies, providing goods, services, and opportunities for exchange that extended well beyond their immediate locations. In France, the Duchy of Normandy represented perhaps the clearest example of long-term Viking influence. Initially granted as a strategic concession to Viking leader Rollo, Normandy evolved into a fully integrated political entity. By the late 11th century, the Norman nobility, descended from Scandinavian settlers, had embraced Christianity and adapted to local laws and administrative practices. They maintained military and naval capabilities, but also oversaw taxation, urban planning, and trade. Normandy's development illustrated a transformation from frontier territory vulnerable to raids into a stable, organized duchy capable of exerting influence in both regional and international affairs. Trade networks maintained by Viking descendants continued to expand during this period. Maritime and riverine routes connected northern Europe to the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and the East. Timber, furs, amber, and iron moved southward, while silver, wine, salt, and exotic goods traveled north. The Varangian routes through Eastern Europe facilitated trade with Byzantium and the Islamic world, enabling access to coins, luxury textiles, and other high-value commodities. These networks were no longer solely associated with raiding expeditions. They had become sustained commercial systems supporting long-term economic growth and cultural exchange. Military organization also evolved as Scandinavian communities settled permanently. The longship remained a potent symbol and practical tool, but its role shifted from facilitating surprise attacks to supporting trade and defense. Local militias, fortifications, and coordinated patrols became standard in both urban and rural areas influenced by Scandinavian settlers. Battles, when they occurred, were often focused on territorial disputes, political ambitions, or alliances rather than sudden raids. Scandinavian leaders applied strategic planning, negotiating, and tactical coordination to maintain authority and protect their communities. Religion played a central role in the consolidation of Viking influence. By the 11th century, Christianity had largely supplanted the Old Norse pagan beliefs among Scandinavian settlers in Europe. Churches, monasteries, and religious institutions were no longer targets of raids, but partners in governance and social cohesion. Participation in religious observances strengthened social bonds, provided legitimacy for rulers, and facilitated integration with the surrounding population. Scandinavian leaders adopted Christian practices not merely for belief, but also as a practical means of consolidating power and aligning with broader European norms. The cultural influence of Vikings during this period remained evident in language, architecture, and urban planning. In England, place names of Norse origin persisted, marking areas of historical settlement. Legal terms and social customs reflected a blend of Scandinavian and local traditions. In Normandy, fortifications, town layouts, and agricultural practices demonstrated the integration of northern and continental methods. Ireland's urban centres reflected a mix of Scandinavian urban planning and Gaelic traditions, producing towns that were uniquely hybrid in character. This fusion of influences created enduring cultural patterns that persisted well into the medieval period. The transformation from raiders to settlers also reflected generational change. By the 11th century, most individuals identified as Vikings were no longer engaged in seasonal expeditions. Children born in Europe had limited experience with the violent raiding lifestyle of their ancestors. They were educated in local languages, immersed in Christian practices, and raised in communities that emphasized trade, land management, and political involvement. As a result, Scandinavian descendants contributed to European development in ways that were increasingly administrative, economic, and social rather than combative. In Eastern Europe, the Varangian routes continued to facilitate both commerce and military involvement. Scandinavian settlers often acted as intermediaries between local populations and distant powers, including the Byzantine Empire. They sometimes served as mercenaries, providing military expertise in exchange for wealth, land, or political influence. These roles required negotiation, coordination, and knowledge of foreign customs. Scandinavian influence in this region was thus multidimensional, combining elements of trade, settlement, and military service within a broader context of political interaction. The later Viking era also saw an increase in urbanization within settled communities. Towns in Ireland, England, and Normandy developed structured marketplaces, administrative offices, and harbour facilities to support both local and long-distance trade. Scandinavian settlers often oversaw these developments, applying knowledge of maritime logistics, taxation, and governance. The presence of a structured urban economy marked a departure from the earlier raiding-focused lifestyle, emphasizing stability, sustainability, and the integration of northern communities into broader European economic networks. Military capabilities remained a factor, but their purpose had shifted. Coastal and river patrols were organized to protect trade routes, monitor potential threats, and enforce local authority. Longships continue to provide mobility, enabling rapid response to conflict or emergencies, but the focus was on defense and commerce rather than offensive raiding. Scandinavian leaders applied strategic and logistical thinking to maintain security, demonstrating an evolution from a purely martial identity to one that combined military skill with administrative and economic responsibilities. By the 12th century, the Viking identity had largely transformed within Europe. Communities of Scandinavian descent were no longer seen as external threats, but as integrated participants in regional governance, trade, and society. Their settlements had matured into established towns and administrative regions, their descendants fully absorbed into local cultures. The maritime expertise, strategic thinking, and organizational skills that had once fueled raiding were now applied to trade, defense, and civic management. The Viking presence, while no longer defined by surprise attacks, had left a durable imprint across the continent. The economic contributions of these communities were significant. Markets, harbors, and trade networks facilitated the movement of goods, labor, and information. Scandinavian settlers participated in long-distance commerce, connecting northern Europe with the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and Eastern Europe. Wealth accumulated through trade, taxation, and land management supported urban growth and regional stability. Scandinavian influence persisted in maritime knowledge, navigation techniques, and logistical organization, providing tools that extended well beyond the Viking Age itself. Socially, the legacy of the Vikings was reflected in governance, family structure, and cultural norms. Leadership continued to be influenced by wealth, reputation, and ability, but integration into local political systems meant that authority was increasingly exercised within established legal frameworks. Kinship networks remained important, but alliances through marriage and civic collaboration expanded the scope of social organization. Communities descended from Scandinavian settlers combined northern traditions with local practices, producing hybrid cultures that were resilient and adaptable. Religious integration further strengthened these communities. Churches, monasteries, and clerical institutions were fully incorporated into governance and daily life. Christian observance provided social cohesion, legitimacy for leaders, and avenues for education and communication. Rituals, festivals, and ecclesiastical structures helped consolidate Scandinavian influence while facilitating assimilation into European culture. Pagan practices gradually disappeared, leaving behind occasional cultural echoes rather than active religious communities. Even as their raiding lifestyle ended, the Vikings remained influential in military matters. Scandinavian descendants participated in campaigns, defended territories, and contributed expertise in both naval and land warfare. Their longships continued to serve as valuable assets for mobility, supply, and patrol, while their knowledge of coastal and riverine terrain informed strategic planning. The combination of martial skill and political acumen allowed Scandinavian communities to maintain a presence in European affairs long after the traditional Viking raids had ceased. By the conclusion of the 11th and 12th centuries, the Viking Age had effectively transitioned into a period of consolidation. The dramatic raiding and sudden coastal assaults that characterized earlier centuries had largely ended. Scandinavian influence persisted, but it was expressed through trade, governance, settlement, and cultural integration rather than surprise attack. Towns, regions, and trade networks created during this era continued to evolve, leaving a lasting imprint on Europe's political, economic, and cultural landscape. Moving into the 12th century, northern European communities that once experienced Viking raids had developed systems for governance, commerce, and defense that reflected centuries of interaction. Scandinavian descendants participated in town councils, collected revenues, and managed land holdings, contributing to regional stability. Local populations no longer viewed them primarily as outsiders or marauders, but rather as neighbors, economic partners, and sometimes rulers. Their integration had shifted the focus from violent confrontation to organized civic engagement. Maritime activity continued to play a central role in northern communities. Expertise in navigation, shipbuilding, and riverine transport supported commercial exchange, facilitated movement of people, and allowed for monitoring of waterways. Coastal settlements prospered with ports, warehouses, and docks enabling the flow of goods. These operations connected distant markets from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, creating an early network of trade that encouraged urban growth and specialization. Scandinavian influence contributed practical skills that supported economic expansion across a broad geographic area. Military organization remained relevant but in a transformed form. Local forces relied on small, well-trained units capable of defending territory and trade routes. Longships, previously tools for surprise attacks, now functioned to patrol coasts, transport supplies, or respond to threats. Leaders coordinated with neighboring settlements to provide mutual security, often negotiating terms to maintain peace and protect commerce. This shift demonstrated an emphasis on strategic oversight, diplomacy, and preparedness rather than opportunistic plundering. Urban development reflected both continuity and adaptation. Towns initially founded by Scandinavian settlers had grown into structured communities with marketplaces, administrative buildings, and residential districts. Trading goods such as timber, metalwork, textiles, and preserved foods supported growing populations. Local artisans, merchants, and laborers participated in networks that connected coastal and inland regions. Scandinavian involvement contributed experience in logistics, port management, and economic planning, producing durable systems that outlasted the Viking era itself. Social structures evolved alongside economic and political developments. Kinship networks remained significant for inheritance and social cohesion, while marital alliances facilitated integration into broader communities. Status was increasingly determined by civic participation, wealth management, and leadership ability rather than martial success alone. Women continued to play crucial roles in maintaining households, supervising trade operations, and managing estates during absences of male relatives. Generational continuity ensured that Scandinavian cultural traits remained present, yet fully adapted to the surrounding society. Religious institutions strengthened social and political integration. Churches, previously occasional targets of raids, served as centers for education, law, and cultural exchange. Clergy mediated disputes, collected tithers, and facilitated community organization. Christian practices aligned Scandinavian settlers with the broader European framework, enhancing legitimacy. fostering alliances and supporting literacy and record-keeping. Religious participation provided a consistent structure for governance, social cohesion, and cultural continuity. Trade networks extended across northern and eastern Europe, connecting communities once linked through raiding routes. Timber, amber, and furs continued to move south, while silver, wine, spices, and luxury items traveled northward. Eastern routes connected settlements along the Volga and Dnieper with Byzantium, the Islamic world, and regions beyond. Scandinavian settlers acted as intermediaries, overseeing transactions, providing transport, and mediating between distant powers. These commercial connections encouraged urbanization, enhanced wealth accumulation, and established patterns of exchange that persisted well into later centuries. Military skills remained valued, although the focus shifted toward defense and strategic positioning. Coastal patrols monitored waterways, while inland settlements organized militias to protect property and enforce local authority. Leaders trained contingents in navigation, reconnaissance, and rapid mobilization, drawing upon centuries of accumulated knowledge. Engagements were limited and tactical, focusing on disputes over resources, territorial boundaries, or political influence, rather than indiscriminate raids. This gradual professionalization of defense ensured that communities were resilient while maintaining flexibility. Cultural influence was also evident across architecture, language, and administrative practice. Scandinavian elements persisted in place names, local terminology, and legal concepts. Building techniques influenced fortifications, harbor construction, and domestic structures. Urban layouts incorporated features suited for both defense and trade, reflecting lessons learned from centuries of maritime activity. This integration created hybrid cultural zones, where Scandinavian heritage blended with indigenous customs to produce distinctive regional identities. Population dynamics reinforced these patterns. Generations born within Europe had little direct experience of raiding, instead participating in local governance, commerce, and family life. They maintained awareness of ancestral origins, yet their priorities reflected the environment in which they were raised: trade, law, land management, and civic responsibilities. Over time, Scandinavian identity merged with local cultures, producing communities with dual heritage and enduring connections to northern traditions without relying on aggressive expansion. Eastern regions retained evidence of Viking influence through fortified settlements, trade centers, and military service. Scandinavian groups operated along rivers that facilitated access to distant markets and political entities. They sometimes served as mercenaries, advisors, or administrators, applying organizational knowledge gained from northern experience. Interaction with Byzantium and neighboring polities encouraged cultural adaptation, the adoption of foreign practices, and the creation of networks that linked northern Europe to the wider world. The end of large-scale raiding also corresponded with demographic stability and economic growth. Urban centers increased in size and sophistication, supporting specialized labor and commerce. Settlements organized resources efficiently, building warehouses, docks, and marketplaces. Agricultural productivity improved through land management, irrigation, and domestication of livestock. Scandinavian settlers applied practical expertise in these areas, contributing to long-term stability and prosperity. Law and governance reflected a mixture of indigenous and Scandinavian approaches. Courts and local councils adjudicated disputes, regulated trade, and managed property claims. Leaders derived authority through recognized legal processes and civic service, rather than martial dominance alone. Kinship and social ties continued to influence power structures, but civic participation and wealth management became equally important for determining status. This balance of tradition and innovation ensured that Scandinavian descended communities were integrated yet retained aspects of their ancestral identity. Cultural continuity remained visible in everyday life. Maritime knowledge, including ship construction, navigation, and coastal resource management, persisted as a specialized skill. Crafts such as metalworking, timber processing, and textile production retain distinctive techniques inherited from northern traditions. Artifacts, inscriptions, and local practices continue to reflect Scandinavian influence, while operating within the framework of settled European societies. By the mid-12th century, Europe had largely absorbed the Scandinavian settlers who had once appeared as raiders. The memory of sudden, violent incursions remained in chronicles, local legends, and recorded histories, yet daily life reflected collaboration, trade, and governance. Communities functioned with regular economic rhythms, legal oversight, and social hierarchies. Maritime routes connected regions, settlements maintained fortifications for security rather than plunder, and trade networks expanded to include distant markets. Scandinavian influence persisted, but in a form that reinforced societal stability and cultural exchange. Population integration also promoted linguistic and social blending. Names, words, and terms of Scandinavian origin persisted in local languages, reflecting historical settlement patterns. Administrative practices, place organization, and legal concepts bore the imprint of northern customs adapted to local environments. Communities developed hybrid identities that were neither fully indigenous nor purely Scandinavian, representing the cumulative effect of generations of interaction. Trade and resource management remained central. Settlements engaged in the export of timber, furs and metals, and imported items such as silver, wine, spices, and luxury goods. Eastern connections through river networks facilitated long-distance exchange, often involving negotiation and logistical oversight rather than coercion. Urban populations relied on these networks to sustain local economies, expand markets, and encourage cultural interaction. Scandinavian expertise contributed directly to the efficiency, reliability, and reach of these economic systems. Military capability, while still important, had become integrated into broader civic and political strategies. Settlements maintained small, trained contingents, patrolled waterways, and defended trade routes. Leaders negotiated alliances, mediated conflicts, and ensured stability through both strategy and diplomacy. The emphasis shifted from short-term gains to long-term sustainability, with military skill applied to protect commerce, maintain political authority, and preserve social cohesion. By the late 12th century, the Scandinavian presence throughout northern and western Europe had become thoroughly established. Regions once vulnerable to sudden maritime strikes were now fortified, organized, and economically interdependent. Coastal settlements had developed docks, warehouses, and markets that supported both local trade and long-distance commerce. Former raiders now operated within systems of governance and administration, serving as mayors, magistrates, or local lords. Their influence persisted not through fear, but through economic and political integration. Commerce had expanded into complex networks connecting Scandinavia, the British Isles, France, and even parts of the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. Timber, iron, amber, and furs moved outward from northern lands, while silver, spices, wine, and textiles arrived from foreign ports. River systems enabled inland distribution of goods, while coastal hubs facilitated international exchange. Merchants of Scandinavian descent applied expertise in navigation, port logistics, and inventory management, contributing to the efficiency and reliability of trade. Their knowledge of long-distance travel, combined with strategic positioning of settlements, allowed for the establishment of networks that linked diverse regions. Urban centers had grown both in population and infrastructure. Towns in Ireland, England, Normandy, and the Scottish Islands were organized around marketplaces, administrative offices, and residential districts. Roads, bridges, and docks reflected the legacy of centuries of maritime activity. Scandinavian settlers, often holding positions of authority, managed taxation, oversight of commerce, and urban planning. These cities became self-sufficient, supporting local economies while maintaining connections with external markets. The presence of skilled artisans, merchants, and administrators ensured that urban life could thrive without relying on raiding. Social structures adapted to the permanence of settlement. Kinship remained important for inheritance, loyalty, and social support, but civic engagement, wealth accumulation, and participation in governance became equally significant for determining social standing. Marital alliances were used to consolidate influence, create partnerships, and stabilize communities. Women played essential roles in estate management, trade operations, and family oversight. These patterns of integration reflected a society transitioning from mobility and raiding to stability and local governance. Religious practices had fully shifted toward Christianity, reinforcing social cohesion and political legitimacy. Churches, monasteries, and other ecclesiastical institutions provided education, law mediation, and centers for community gatherings. Clerics often served as record keepers, advisors, and administrators, bridging local customs and Scandinavian heritage. The incorporation of religious institutions into civic and commercial life facilitated social integration, creating networks of authority and shared practice that extended beyond individual settlements. Military activity became specialized, focusing on defense, protection of commerce, and maintenance of political authority. Former raiders trained local militias, patrolled waterways, and ensured the security of trade routes. Fortifications were maintained not solely to repel invaders, but to uphold social order and protect property. Leaders exercised strategic judgment, negotiating alliances and mediating disputes with both neighboring settlements and distant powers. The emphasis shifted from short-term opportunistic gain to long-term stability and resilience. Language, legal practice, and cultural identity reflected gradual assimilation. Place names of Norse origin persisted, often marking areas of settlement or historical significance. Terms relating to trade, navigation, and governance were retained, integrated into local languages. Legal customs, including property rights, inheritance laws, and dispute resolution, blended Scandinavian practices with indigenous frameworks. These cultural imprints endured, shaping local identities and regional governance patterns over centuries. Eastern Europe continued to host Scandinavian activity along riverine trade routes. Settlements along the Dnieper, Volga, and other navigable waterways served as commercial and political hubs. Scandinavian-descended communities operated as intermediaries, facilitating exchange between local populations and foreign powers, including Byzantium and the Islamic world. Their expertise in logistics, administration, and maritime transport contributed to the efficiency and reach of these networks. Generational integration resulted in a population that was culturally hybrid, participating in local affairs while retaining ancestral knowledge of northern maritime and organizational practices. Population growth and urban development reinforced social and economic stability. Towns established markets, warehouses, and administrative structures to support growing populations and commercial activity. Agriculture expanded through improved management of land and resources. Maritime transport ensured steady supply of goods, while inland routes distributed resources efficiently. Scandinavian settlers applied practical knowledge in port management, inventory, and resource allocation, contributing directly to the growth and sustainability of local economies. Civic institutions evolved to reflect both indigenous and Scandinavian traditions. Councils, courts, and local leadership bodies adjudicated disputes, regulated commerce, and managed urban infrastructure. Authority depended not only on ancestry or martial skill, but on participation in governance, economic competence, and social relationships. Communities developed mechanisms for cooperation, negotiation, and conflict resolution that incorporated centuries of accumulated experience from Scandinavian and local traditions. Cultural continuity persisted in architecture, craft, and daily practices. Shipbuilding, timber work, and metal crafting maintained techniques inherited from northern regions. Urban layouts reflected an understanding of defense, commerce, and social interaction. Artifacts, inscriptions, and material culture preserved elements of Scandinavian heritage within the evolving European context. Over time, this integration produced hybrid communities capable of thriving in multiple cultural environments. By the mid-12th century, large-scale raids had effectively ceased. Historical memory preserved accounts of past attacks, but contemporary communities operated on principles of cooperation, trade, and governance. Scandinavian influence was visible in administration, commerce, urban development, and cultural practices. Towns and regions once vulnerable to sudden attacks had become centers of social, political, and economic activity, demonstrating the enduring impact of northern settlers on European development. The maritime tradition, a defining characteristic of early Viking activity, continued to shape northern European economies. Expertise in navigation, ship construction, and cargo management enabled efficient transport of goods and people. Ports and river settlements served as hubs for both local distribution and long-distance trade. Knowledge of coastal and riverine environments ensured that transportation networks remained effective and resilient, reinforcing economic stability and regional connectivity. Leadership structures were increasingly institutionalized. Authority derived from wealth, civic engagement, and governance capability rather than purely from military prowess. Local leaders coordinated trade, defense, and legal oversight, maintaining the security and prosperity of settlements. Kinship and social networks supported cohesion, while participation in civic life reinforced legitimacy. The result was a system that combined traditional Scandinavian values with practical adaptations to the European context. Cultural and linguistic integration continued. Scandinavian-derived words, place names, and legal terms persisted in local languages, reflecting historical settlement patterns. Artisanal skills, including shipbuilding, metalwork, and textile production, were retained within local economies. Urban planning and fortification techniques, inherited from northern experience, influenced the development of towns and regional infrastructure. These elements contributed to distinct cultural landscapes that blended Scandinavian and indigenous influences. Eastern European settlements maintained commercial and strategic importance. Scandinavian descended communities continued to serve as intermediaries for trade and military coordination. River networks allowed for movement of goods, personnel, and information, linking northern Europe with Byzantium, the Islamic world, and other distant regions. Administrative knowledge, logistical skill, and maritime expertise supported the sustainability of these networks, ensuring the continued relevance of Scandinavian heritage even outside the homeland. Demographic trends reinforced integration. Children born in Europe inherited both Scandinavian and local traditions, with upbringing focused on civic participation, trade, land management, and cultural education. Over generations, the identity of these communities shifted from one defined by raiding and mobility to one characterized by settlement, governance, and commerce. The practical skills, knowledge, and cultural heritage of ancestors were retained, but they were applied in contexts that emphasized stability and collaboration rather than conflict. By the 13th century, Europe had fully absorbed the Scandinavian influence. Towns once vulnerable to maritime attacks had developed urban infrastructure, administrative systems, and trade networks that endured beyond the Viking Age. Scandinavian settlers were integrated into local society, serving as leaders, merchants, and skilled artisans. Their contributions to trade, governance, and cultural development shaped the trajectory of northern and western Europe, producing a legacy that extended into the late medieval period. Into the 13th century, Scandinavian descended communities were almost fully integrated into the broader European landscape. The once dominant identity associated with maritime raids had largely disappeared, replaced by roles in governance, trade, and civic life. Former raiding towns had matured into urban centers with well-developed markets, civic administration, and port facilities. Coastal and river settlements functioned as nodes of economic exchange, connecting hinterlands to international trade networks. Scandinavian expertise in maritime logistics and navigation continued to provide practical advantages in commerce and communication, ensuring that these communities retained a unique, albeit less martial, influence. Trade had become highly organized, moving beyond simple exchanges of raw materials. Timber, iron, amber, and furs from northern lands traveled southward, while silver, wine, salt, and luxury goods reached northern settlements. Markets within towns facilitated complex transactions, including credit arrangements, contracts, and agreements that connected local producers with distant consumers. Scandinavian settlers contributed knowledge of long-distance navigation, shipbuilding, and inventory management, which allowed urban centers to thrive economically. River routes, which had previously enabled rapid raiding, now served as vital arteries for trade, communication, and administrative oversight. Urban infrastructure had reached a level of sophistication previously unseen in these regions. Streets were organized to accommodate trade, residential areas, and civic spaces. Harbors and docks provided storage for goods, facilities for ship maintenance, and points of departure for trade expeditions. Market squares supported local commerce, while administrative offices and town halls ensured legal oversight, collection of revenues, and coordination of civic projects. Scandinavian participation in these structures reinforced the transition from itinerant raiding to permanent settlement, embedding northern skills within European governance frameworks. Social hierarchies reflected both traditional Scandinavian values and adaptation to European norms. Kinship ties remained significant for inheritance and social cohesion, but civic leadership, commercial success, and legal competence became central determinants of status. Marital alliances were used strategically to consolidate influence across settlements and regions. Women played critical roles in managing estates, overseeing trade, and supervising households, ensuring continuity of operations during absences of male family members. Over generations, these integrated communities created stable social networks that balanced ancestral traditions with local European expectations. Religious institutions had grown central to civic and cultural life. Churches, abbeys, and parish organizations provided education, legal arbitration, and spaces for social interaction. Clergy served as record keepers, advisors, and administrators, linking Scandinavian settlers to broader European systems of governance. The Christian faith reinforced communal cohesion, facilitated integration, and legitimized authority. Pagan practices had largely disappeared, leaving occasional traces in folklore, ritual symbolism, or regional memory rather than ongoing religious practice. Military expertise remained valued, although the purpose of armed forces had shifted. Settlements maintained trained contingents to protect commerce, defend property, and uphold local authority. Longships, once tools for raiding, were used for patrol, transport, and logistical support. Leaders focused on strategy, coordination, and diplomacy rather than opportunistic attacks. This evolution demonstrated a society capable of applying martial skills in constructive ways, preserving the advantage of mobility and tactical knowledge, while supporting stable and organized communities. Cultural legacy endured across language, law, and material culture. Scandinavian-derived terminology persisted in local dialects, particularly in urban centers, ports, and regions with historical settlement. Legal practices and dispute resolution incorporated northern principles alongside indigenous frameworks. Architectural styles reflected functional knowledge acquired from maritime life, including efficient use of timber, defensive fortifications, and port management techniques. Crafts, metalwork, and navigation knowledge were passed down through generations, embedding northern expertise into local economies. In Eastern Europe, Scandinavian influence continued through riverine settlements. Towns along the Dnieper, Volga, and other navigable waterways functioned as centers of commerce, governance, and diplomacy. Scandinavian descendants often acted as intermediaries between local populations and distant powers such as Byzantium or the Islamic caliphates. Administrative expertise, logistical management, and familiarity with long-distance trade sustained the importance of these settlements over multiple generations. Populations were culturally hybrid, retaining northern heritage while adopting local languages, customs, and political practices. Population integration over generations reinforced stability. Children born in these communities were raised with awareness of ancestral traditions, but educated in local customs, Christian practices, and civic responsibilities. They participated in trade, urban administration, and social networks that ensured cohesion. Northern heritage persisted primarily through skills, practices, and certain cultural markers rather than martial activity or raiding identity. Scandinavian lineage remained a point of distinction, but its expression had shifted toward economic and civic competence. Economic patterns reflected a mature integration of Scandinavian and local practices. Ports and river towns facilitated large-scale distribution of goods, while inland markets provided access to local resources. Northern settlers applied maritime knowledge, logistical planning, and organizational skills to enhance trade efficiency. Merchants coordinated transactions, maintained inventories, and negotiated contracts with distant partners. Agricultural production was optimized through land management practices influenced by Scandinavian experience in resource allocation, livestock care, and seasonal planning. Governance had become institutionalized across these regions. Local councils, courts, and urban administrations managed disputes, trade regulations, and civic projects. Leadership depended on competence, participation, and wealth rather than purely inherited status or military prowess. Kinship networks continued to support cohesion and succession planning, but broader civic structures ensured accountability, stability, and predictable governance. Scandinavian descendants contributed expertise and traditions while fully engaging with the established legal and administrative systems. Cultural influence remained visible in towns, settlements, and rural regions. Urban planning incorporated efficient layouts, defense-oriented structures, and port facilities suited to commerce and communication. Craft techniques, including woodworking, metalworking, and textile production, reflected northern traditions adapted to local markets. Place names of Scandinavian origin marked settlement patterns, historical influence, and geographic features. These elements created a landscape in which northern heritage was visible, functional, and integrated into the daily lives of inhabitants. Maritime networks continued to connect Europe in practical ways. Long-distance routes facilitated exchange of timber, furs, amber, iron, silver, wine, and textiles. Ports served as logistical hubs, providing repair facilities, warehouses, and coordination points for transport. Scandinavian expertise in navigation and ship construction enhanced reliability and efficiency, enabling settlements to participate fully in continental trade systems. These networks supported urban growth, resource distribution, and cultural exchange across northern, western, and eastern Europe. Military and civic functions were intertwined. Settlements maintained patrols and trained contingents to enforce local authority, protect trade, and mediate disputes. Leaders relied on strategic oversight, negotiation, and alliance building. Fortifications, originally constructed to repel raiders, now served multiple purposes: protection against sporadic threats, control of access to trade routes, and symbolic demonstration of civic authority. The skill set developed over centuries of raiding was repurposed to support stability and prosperity rather than plunder. By the early 14th century, Scandinavian identity within Europe had fully merged with local societies. Towns and regions formerly associated with raiding now operated as integrated civic, commercial, and administrative units. Scandinavian descended populations contributed to governance, trade, craft, and cultural life without maintaining the raiding lifestyle of ancestors. knowledge of maritime logistics, navigation, urban planning, and administration continued to influence European societies, leaving a lasting legacy of skill, adaptability, and integration. Religious life remained a cornerstone of community identity. Churches, abbeys, and parish networks provided social cohesion, education, and legal mediation. Christian observance reinforced alliances, legitimized authority, and offered opportunities for literacy and record-keeping. Former centers of Scandinavian raids had transformed into sites of worship, civic administration, and economic coordination. Religious institutions supported the integration of northern descendants into European culture, shaping moral, social, and political norms. Generational continuity preserved cultural knowledge without reliance on raiding. Children and grandchildren of Scandinavian settlers inherited skills in maritime transport, logistics, governance, and craftwork. These competencies were applied to civic, commercial, and administrative contexts rather than plundering. Family networks ensured the transfer of expertise, while engagement with local institutions reinforced social cohesion. Scandinavian heritage was maintained through practical contributions to community life, rather than through violence or conquest. Cultural assimilation produced hybrid societies. Language, legal customs, and daily practices blended northern traditions with local European frameworks. Towns reflected integrated architectural styles, defensive techniques, and port management methods. Markets and trade networks incorporated northern knowledge while facilitating participation in regional and international commerce. Hybrid identity ensured the survival of Scandinavian influence while supporting the stability and prosperity of European settlements. In the later Middle Ages, Scandinavian descendants throughout northern and western Europe had become integral parts of the social, economic, and political landscape. Communities that had once faced raids now operated as thriving towns, villages, and coastal settlements. Their daily life revolved around commerce, agriculture, craft, and civic engagement, rather than plundering or sudden military expeditions. Ports that had previously served raiders now functioned as hubs of trade, equipped with warehouses, docks, and facilities for ship repair. Knowledge inherited from centuries of maritime activity continued to guide navigation, shipbuilding, and management of commercial fleets, ensuring that settlements maintained efficient connections across seas and rivers. Urban expansion reflected both stability and sophistication. Towns were organized around marketplaces, administrative buildings, and residential quarters, providing spaces for commerce, governance, and social life. Streets facilitated the flow of goods, people, and information, while fortifications, once essential to repel raiders, were maintained for security, regulation, and symbolic presence. Scandinavian settlers occupied influential roles within civic councils, oversaw taxation, and coordinated trade, shaping urban life while integrating fully with local customs and institutions. Economic networks had become intricate and reliable. Commodities from northern regions, including timber, furs, iron, and amber, continued to flow southward, while silver, textiles, wine, and other luxury goods moved north. Rivers and coastlines served as critical transportation routes, enabling inland distribution of resources. Scandinavian expertise in logistics, inventory management, and maritime coordination allowed settlements to maintain regular exchange with distant regions. Long-established commercial practices fostered stability and encouraged the specialization of labor, which further strengthened urban and regional economies. Agricultural development complemented these urban and commercial systems. Settlers cultivated land more efficiently through techniques inherited from northern traditions and adapted to local conditions. Livestock management, crop rotation, and irrigation supported food security, while surplus production contributed to trade and the growth of towns. Families engaged in both cultivation and commerce, balancing local subsistence with participation in larger economic networks. Generational knowledge ensured that expertise in resource management was passed down and adapted to evolving circumstances. Social structures reflected the fusion of Scandinavian and local traditions. Kinship networks retained importance for inheritance and social cohesion, while civic participation, trade success, and administrative competence became central to status. Strategic marriages linked families across towns, regions, and even nations, consolidating influence and ensuring continuity of property and authority. Women continued to play vital roles, overseeing estates, supervising trade, and managing households. These structures created resilient communities capable of navigating the political, economic, and social challenges of the late medieval period. Religious integration had become complete. Churches, abbeys, and parish networks were central to education, social coordination, and legal oversight. Scandinavian descendants participated fully in Christian observance, contributing to the construction of religious buildings, the administration of tithes, and the maintenance of ecclesiastical law. Religious life reinforced cohesion, provided moral and ethical guidance, and linked communities to wider regional and continental structures. Formerly raided monasteries now flourished under patronage, serving as centers of learning, literacy, and culture. Military and defensive capabilities were maintained, but their focus had shifted entirely to protection and regulation. Trained contingents guarded trade routes, patrolled rivers, and secured towns. Coastal settlements monitored maritime access to protect property and commerce. Fortifications functioned both as deterrents and as symbols of civic authority. Leaders applied strategic planning and coordination to maintain stability, emphasizing preparedness, negotiation, and local alliances rather than opportunistic aggression. The legacy of centuries of maritime and tactical knowledge was adapted to the realities of settled life. Cultural influence remained evident in language, law, and material heritage. Northern-derived terms persisted in local dialects, particularly in regions with historical settlement. Legal frameworks incorporated Scandinavian practices into broader European systems. Architectural techniques, including efficient use of timber, defensive fortifications, and port infrastructure, reflected northern expertise. Artisanal methods, such as shipbuilding, metalwork, and textile production, continued to be practiced and adapted to local markets. These elements created communities with a distinctive heritage while fully integrated into the regional context. Eastern European settlements continued to serve as commercial and strategic centers. Scandinavian descended populations acted as intermediaries for trade between local communities and distant powers, including Byzantium and regions further south and east. These communities applied administrative and logistical expertise to manage transactions, oversee transport, and maintain urban organization. Their influence extended across multiple generations, producing culturally hybrid populations capable of operating successfully within local and international systems. Population continuity reinforced cultural integration. Children born into Scandinavian descended families were raised with awareness of ancestral skills but oriented toward local society. Education, religious instruction, civic participation, and apprenticeship in trade ensured that knowledge of maritime activity, commerce, and governance was preserved without reliance on raiding. Identity gradually transformed from one associated with mobility and plunder to one defined by civic responsibility, professional competence, and cultural adaptability. By the 14th century, the Scandinavian legacy had become fully embedded across northern and western Europe. Towns once vulnerable to sudden attacks now functioned as organized centers of governance, commerce, and social life. Ports and river towns connected regional and international trade networks. Scandinavian settlers participated in administration, managed resources, and contributed practical expertise to urban and rural economies. Their presence shaped the trajectory of communities for generations, influencing infrastructure, commerce, social organization, and cultural practice. Trade networks had matured into complex, long-distance systems. Timber, furs, iron, and amber continued to be exported, while silver, textiles, and wine were imported to northern settlements. Urban centers acted as hubs for processing, storage, and redistribution. Scandinavian expertise in navigation, shipping, and logistics ensured that these operations functioned efficiently and reliably. Markets were organized with oversight, enabling exchange, regulation, and coordination across broad geographic areas. Economic stability encouraged population growth, urban expansion, and specialization of labor, further embedding northern traditions within European systems. Civic administration reflected centuries of accumulated experience. Local councils, courts, and guilds regulated commerce, adjudicated disputes, and managed infrastructure. Leaders were selected based on competence, reputation, and civic engagement rather than purely inherited status. Kinship networks supplemented authority and ensured continuity, while alliances created through marriage, trade, and negotiation strengthened political stability. Scandinavian descendants applied knowledge gained from centuries of maritime organization, tactical coordination, and administrative management to support governance and social cohesion. Cultural blending produced enduring identities. Architecture, urban planning, and fortification techniques reflected northern influence while adapting to local needs. Crafts, metallurgy, and textile production incorporated northern skills alongside local methods. Place names, legal terminology, and social customs retained traces of Scandinavian origin. These communities represented a synthesis of northern and local traditions, demonstrating adaptability, resilience, and lasting cultural impact. Maritime knowledge continued to underpin regional development. Ports, rivers, and coastal settlements facilitated trade, transport, and communication. Navigation expertise, shipbuilding skills, and logistical understanding ensured the reliability of goods movement and travel. Northern settlers applied these competencies in practical ways, contributing to the growth and sustainability of urban centers, the efficiency of trade networks, and the organization of local and regional economies. Military capability, while no longer associated with raids, remained an element of security and civic order. Contingents patrolled waterways, secured urban centers, and coordinated with neighboring settlements to maintain stability. Fortifications were maintained to regulate access, demonstrate authority, and protect commerce. Leaders employed strategic judgment and diplomacy, balancing security with trade and social harmony. The experience gained over centuries of mobility, conflict, and coordination was fully integrated into civic and economic practice, enhancing resilience. Education and cultural life reflected integration and adaptation. Churches, monasteries, and parish institutions provided literacy, record keeping, and instruction in law, religion, and practical skills. Apprenticeships in craft and commerce ensured transmission of expertise across generations. Scandinavian derived techniques and knowledge persisted through application in trade, shipbuilding, resource management, and governance. Communities maintained continuity of practical skills while fully participating in regional and continental intellectual and cultural networks. Population continuity reinforced stability. Families raised children in local customs, Christian faith, civic responsibility, and trade practice. Northern traditions were preserved through skills, knowledge, and cultural memory rather than through raiding or military activity. Multi-generational integration produced societies with hybrid identities, capable of thriving in diverse environments, maintaining economic and social networks, and contributing meaningfully to regional development. By the 15th century, the presence of Scandinavian descended communities across northern and western Europe had become indistinguishable from local populations in many respects. Former raiding settlements had long since evolved into structured towns and villages with organized governance, permanent infrastructure, and established commercial systems. Ports that had once been bases for sudden attacks now supported regular shipping, trade, and communication networks extending from the North Sea to the Mediterranean and beyond. Scandinavian maritime expertise continued to guide shipbuilding, navigation, and cargo management, though these skills were applied to commerce and civic administration rather than plunder. Urban growth reflected centuries of stability and prosperity. Streets and neighborhoods were planned to support trade, housing, and administrative functions. Marketplaces facilitated exchanges of both local produce and imported goods, while administrative buildings provided oversight of taxation, law, and civic affairs. Harbors were equipped for storage, repair, and coordination of fleets, ensuring the smooth operation of commerce. Scandinavian descended leaders participated in municipal councils, oversaw trade regulation, and managed urban development, blending inherited northern knowledge with local governance traditions. Trade networks had expanded in scope and complexity. Northern resources such as timber, iron, amber, and furs continued to flow southward, while imported commodities including silver, wine, textiles, and spices arrived in northern ports. River systems and coastal routes enabled inland distribution, connecting rural producers to urban markets. Scandinavian expertise in logistics, navigation, and port management facilitated the efficient movement of goods, supporting both regional stability and international commerce. The integration of northern knowledge into trade practices ensured reliability and encouraged long-term economic growth. Agriculture had matured alongside urban development. Settlements relied on both subsistence and commercial cultivation. Crop rotation, livestock management, and irrigation systems provided consistent yields. Surplus production supported trade, feeding urban populations and contributing to the economic stability of towns and surrounding regions. Scandinavian descended families applied practical experience inherited from centuries of settlement and resource management to optimize agricultural output and integrate rural production with urban commerce. Social hierarchies reflected both northern traditions and European adaptation. Kinship and family ties remained central to inheritance, social cohesion, and influence, but participation in civic administration, trade, and professional expertise became increasingly important determinants of status. Strategic marriages created alliances between families, towns, and regions, consolidating wealth and influence. Women continued to play vital roles in estate management, commerce, and household operations, ensuring continuity of knowledge and contributing to social stability. Religious institutions had become deeply embedded in daily life. Churches, monasteries, and parish networks provided education, legal oversight, and moral guidance. Scandinavian descended populations participated fully in Christian rituals and administrative structures. Clerics oversaw record-keeping, dispute resolution, and local governance, linking communities to broader regional networks. Sites that had once been targets of Viking raids were now centers of learning, cultural production, and spiritual life, reinforcing integration and civic cohesion. Military structures had adapted entirely to the realities of settled life. Trained units guarded towns, ports, and trade routes. Fortifications served as deterrents against sporadic threats rather than instruments for raiding. Leaders relied on strategy, negotiation, and coordination to maintain peace and security. Knowledge gained from centuries of maritime and military activity was preserved in training, tactics, and logistical management, applied to civic defense rather than offensive action. Cultural continuity persisted through architecture, craft, and material production. Scandinavian techniques in timber construction, shipbuilding, and metalwork were applied to local projects, influencing both functional infrastructure and aesthetic design. Urban planning incorporated defensive layouts, efficient use of space, and port facilities. Artisanal knowledge continued to be transmitted through apprenticeship systems, ensuring that northern traditions remained active while fully integrated into European social and economic life. Eastern European settlements maintained long-standing connections to trade and governance. Communities along major rivers served as hubs linking northern Europe with Byzantium, the Islamic world, and other distant regions. Scandinavian descended populations acted as intermediaries, applying administrative, logistical, and maritime expertise to manage commerce and political negotiation. These communities were culturally hybrid, incorporating local customs while preserving practical northern knowledge, sustaining influence across generations. Population dynamics reinforced stability and integration. Children born into Scandinavian descended families were educated in local language, civic responsibilities, Christian faith, and commercial practice. Skills such as navigation, trade management, and resource allocation were transmitted within families and guilds. Over generations, identity shifted from one defined by mobility and raiding to one characterized by civic engagement, professional competence, and cultural continuity. Heritage was maintained through practical application rather than martial activity. Economic patterns had reached maturity. Northern ports and river towns became central hubs for the distribution of resources. Timber, furs, iron, and amber continued to circulate, while imported goods supported urban consumption and trade expansion. Scandinavian expertise in maritime logistics, inventory management, and port coordination ensured the reliability of these networks. Local and regional economies benefited from this continuity, supporting population growth, urban development, and specialization of labor. Governance structures had evolved into complex institutions. Councils, courts, and guilds regulated commerce, resolved disputes, and oversaw public works. Authority depended on skill, civic engagement, and wealth, rather than solely on heritage or military reputation. Kinship networks provided stability and succession, while alliances through marriage and trade reinforced political cohesion. Scandinavian descended leaders applied centuries of accumulated knowledge in organization, strategy, and administration to maintain social order and economic efficiency. Cultural influence was visible in daily life. Place names, legal terms, and linguistic traces preserved evidence of northern origin. Architectural features, fortifications, and urban planning reflected Scandinavian expertise. Craft practices in shipbuilding, metallurgy, and textiles retained northern techniques while serving local markets. Communities embodied hybrid identities, merging northern heritage with local customs to create durable cultural landscapes. Maritime networks continued to underpin trade, communication, and resource movement. Ports, rivers, and coastal settlements enabled the transport of goods, materials, and people. Knowledge of navigation, ship construction, and logistical coordination allowed settlements to maintain consistent connections across regions. These networks provided the basis for urban growth, resource distribution, and regional integration, demonstrating the lasting impact of northern expertise even centuries after the decline of raiding activity. Military readiness remained part of civic life, though applied in defensive contexts. Fortifications, patrols, and trained contingents maintained security and enforced local authority. Strategy, negotiation, and coordination became the primary tools of leadership. Skills developed over centuries of maritime and military experience were repurposed to ensure stability, facilitate trade, and maintain social cohesion. Former raiding communities now exemplified effective, organized, and secure settlements. Education, apprenticeship, and cultural transmission reinforced integration. Churches, monasteries, and guilds provided instruction in literacy, trade, administration, and religious practice. Skills such as navigation, port management, and resource allocation were passed down through families and professional networks. Northern-derived knowledge persisted through practical application, ensuring continuity while fully adapting to European social and economic systems. Population continuity ensured the survival of Scandinavian traditions without reliance on raiding. Multi-generational communities integrated northern practices into local economies, governance, and social life. Heritage was expressed through skill, craft, and organization rather than martial activity. Identity evolved to reflect civic participation, professional competence, and cultural adaptability, producing resilient and enduring communities. By the 15th and early 16th centuries, the Scandinavian descended population had fully assimilated. Distinctions based on northern origin existed mainly in cultural memory, linguistic traces, place names, and certain technical skills, such as shipbuilding or navigation. The raiding identity that had once defined the Viking era had vanished entirely, replaced by integrated civic, economic, and social roles. Communities once shaped by sudden attacks were now stable centers of governance, commerce, and culture, reflecting centuries of adaptation and integration. By the 16th century, centuries of adaptation had transformed the legacy of Scandinavian settlers in Europe. Former raiding settlements had become established towns and regions, fully integrated into the social, economic, and political frameworks of their respective countries. Coastal towns, river settlements, and urban centers that had once faced unpredictable attacks now operated under organized administration. They managed trade, local law, taxation, and infrastructure, demonstrating the full shift from a society of raiding and mobility to one of permanence, stability, and civic engagement. Scandinavian skills in navigation, maritime organization, and resource management remained relevant, yet were now employed entirely within structured and peaceful contexts. Trade networks had grown sophisticated and far-reaching. Northern resources such as timber, iron, furs, and amber continued to move across Europe, while imported commodities including silver, wine, textiles, and spices enriched northern settlements. River systems, coastal ports, and urban warehouses allowed for efficient distribution, enabling inland towns to thrive. Scandinavian knowledge in shipbuilding, logistics, and inventory management underpinned the reliability and reach of these commercial systems. Urban populations benefited from access to diverse goods and a stable economic environment, which encouraged specialization, growth, and prosperity. Urban development reflected centuries of planning, experience, and adaptation. Streets and neighborhoods were arranged for both commerce and social interaction, marketplaces supported local economies, and administrative buildings coordinated civic life. Harbors accommodated the growing scale of maritime activity, with docks, storage facilities, and repair infrastructure supporting long-distance transport. Leadership in these settlements increasingly relied on organizational skill, commercial competence, and civic engagement. Scandinavian descended families participated fully in governance, trade oversight, and community planning, preserving ancestral expertise while integrating seamlessly into European systems. Agriculture remained a foundational aspect of life in settlements and surrounding regions. Land management techniques inherited from northern traditions were adapted to local climates and soils. Crop rotation, livestock care, and irrigation provided steady yields, which supported urban populations and generated surplus for trade. Families applied practical knowledge in resource allocation, storage, and transportation. Over generations, these techniques ensured that both rural and urban communities remained productive, economically resilient, and well integrated into regional markets. Social hierarchies reflected a balance between inherited tradition and practical achievement. Kinship and familial ties continued to play a role in inheritance, loyalty, and social cohesion, while trade success, administrative capability, and civic engagement increasingly determined status. Marital alliances reinforced networks of influence, linking communities, regions, and sometimes nations. Women maintained central roles, managing estates, supervising trade, and maintaining household operations. These arrangements contributed to social stability, continuity, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. Religious institutions had become deeply woven into the fabric of life. Churches, monasteries, and parish organizations provided not only spiritual guidance but also education, legal mediation, and social coordination. Scandinavian descended populations actively participated in Christian practices and administration. Clergy oversaw record keeping, managed charitable activities, and advised leaders, creating networks of knowledge and governance that spanned multiple regions. Sites that had once been targets of raids had transformed into centers of learning, cultural production, and religious authority, reinforcing the integration of northern settlers into European society. Military structures evolved entirely toward defense and civic protection. Trained contingents patrolled rivers, coasts, and towns, maintaining order and safeguarding commerce. Fortifications, including walls and watchtowers, were maintained for deterrence and regulatory purposes, rather than for aggressive raids. Leaders relied on strategic planning, coordination with neighboring settlements, and diplomatic negotiation to maintain peace. Skills developed over centuries of maritime experience and tactical operations were repurposed, ensuring that communities could respond effectively to threats while sustaining productive economic and civic activity. Cultural continuity remained evident in language, architecture, and material practices. Northern-derived terms were preserved in local dialects and legal terminology. Urban design incorporated efficient layouts, fortified elements, and port facilities reflecting centuries of experience. Craft techniques in shipbuilding, metalworking, and textiles continued to be applied and adapted to local contexts. Communities represented a hybrid identity, combining inherited northern practices with local traditions to create distinct, enduring cultural landscapes. Eastern European settlements retained strategic and commercial importance. Scandinavian descended populations managed riverine trade routes, connecting northern Europe with Byzantium, the Islamic world, and other distant regions. Administrative, logistical, and navigational expertise facilitated commerce, political negotiation, and urban organization. These communities maintained cultural hybridity, incorporating local practices while preserving practical skills inherited from northern ancestors. The longevity of these settlements illustrates the durability of Scandinavian influence in multiple geographic contexts. Population continuity reinforced long-term stability. Children born in Scandinavian descended families were raised within local cultural, religious, and civic frameworks while acquiring practical knowledge inherited from their forebears. Skills in trade, navigation, and resource management were transmitted through family networks, guilds, and apprenticeships. Over successive generations, identity transformed from one defined by raiding and mobility to one characterized by civic responsibility, economic competence, and cultural participation. By the 17th century, Scandinavian heritage had fully integrated into European societies, yet left subtle traces that endured. Urban and rural areas reflected northern influence in architecture, legal frameworks, maritime practices, and place names. Trade networks established by earlier generations continued to operate, supported by expertise in logistics, navigation, and administration. Cultural practices, craft techniques, and linguistic traces provided continuity across centuries, even as the distinct Viking identity had disappeared. Communities that had once faced raids were now centers of economic, social, and political stability, demonstrating the adaptability and lasting influence of northern settlers. Education and apprenticeship ensured continued transmission of knowledge. Churches, schools, and guilds provided instruction in literacy, trade, administration, and religious practice. Northern-derived skills such as shipbuilding, navigation, and port management were taught alongside local methods. This integration of practical expertise and local knowledge produced generations of citizens equipped to maintain commerce, governance, and cultural traditions. Heritage persisted through applied competence rather than through martial or raiding activity, reflecting centuries of transformation. Economic systems had reached full maturity. Northern and riverine ports served as hubs for distribution, connecting local production with international trade. Timber, iron, amber, and furs continued to circulate alongside imported commodities such as silver, textiles, and luxury goods. Scandinavian descended families applied organizational knowledge to manage inventories, coordinate transportation, and ensure reliability. Urban populations flourished as trade, craft, and agriculture became interdependent. demonstrating the lasting influence of northern maritime and logistical expertise. Governance structures had evolved into fully institutionalized systems. Town councils, courts, and guilds regulated commerce, adjudicated disputes, and oversaw urban infrastructure. Leadership depended on competence, civic participation, and reputation, rather than purely on inheritance or martial skill. Kinship and marriage networks provided social cohesion, while civic institutions reinforced stability, efficiency, and accountability. Scandinavian descended individuals contributed experience, knowledge, and traditions, shaping communities in ways that reflected both northern heritage and local adaptation. Cultural integration produced enduring hybrid societies. Urban planning, architecture, and fortification methods reflected northern influence adapted to European needs. Craft practices, including metalworking, shipbuilding, and textiles, blended northern techniques with local innovation. Legal and linguistic elements preserved traces of Scandinavian origin. Communities embodied hybrid identities that maintained heritage while participating fully in regional culture, ensuring resilience and adaptability over centuries. Maritime networks continue to underpin regional and international connectivity. Ports, rivers, and coastal settlements facilitated the movement of goods, people, and information. Expertise in navigation, fleet coordination, and logistical management allowed settlements to maintain reliable trade connections. These networks contributed to urban prosperity, integration into larger political and economic systems, and the continuation of northern maritime traditions in applied, non-military forms. Military and security functions remained integrated into civic life. Trained contingents, fortified towns, and patrols ensured protection of commerce, property, and communities. Strategy, planning, and coordination emphasized regulation and defense rather than raiding or expansion. Leadership utilized inherited knowledge of logistics, maritime mobility, and tactical organization to maintain stability, reflecting the transformation of northern martial skills into instruments of civic resilience and economic security. Education and cultural continuity reinforced integration and adaptation. Instruction in literacy, religious practice, trade skills, and navigation ensured the transmission of expertise across generations. Apprenticeships and family instruction maintained northern, derived craft techniques and knowledge. Communities transmitted heritage through practical application, embedding northern traditions into daily life, governance, and commerce. Over time, these elements produced a society in which Viking-era experience remained influential despite the absence of raiding or mobility. By the 18th century, the descendants of Scandinavian settlers had fully integrated into European societies. Their identity was no longer defined by raiding or maritime conquest, but by civic participation, trade, agriculture, and cultural continuity. Towns and cities that had once faced sudden Viking attacks now thrived as centers of governance, commerce, and education. Coastal ports, river settlements, and inland towns all reflected centuries of transformation, having developed permanent infrastructure, efficient administration, and complex economic networks. The skills and knowledge inherited from northern ancestors, navigation, shipbuilding, trade coordination, and resource management, remained valuable, but were now fully adapted to peaceful and productive roles. Trade continued to shape the economic life of Europe. Timber, iron, amber, and furs from northern regions flowed to southern markets, while silver, textiles, wine, and other goods traveled northward. River routes and coastal ports facilitated the inland distribution of goods, linking rural producers with urban markets. Scandinavian descended merchants and administrators applied centuries of logistical knowledge to ensure reliability, efficiency, and profitability. These systems encouraged the growth of urban populations, the specialization of labor, and the integration of local economies into broader European networks. Urban centers had reached a remarkable level of sophistication. Streets, markets, residential areas, and administrative buildings were arranged to support commerce, governance, and community life. Harbors were equipped to accommodate larger ships, provide storage, and facilitate repair and maintenance. Civic councils, led in part by Scandinavian descended families, managed taxation, law, and urban planning. Former raiding communities had transformed into hubs of organization and stability, blending northern maritime expertise with local governance structures to create enduring centers of European life. Agriculture remained central to economic stability. Land management techniques, adapted from northern traditions and refined over generations, ensured productive cultivation. Crop rotation, irrigation, and animal husbandry supported both subsistence and commercial activity. Surpluses were distributed to urban markets, traded across regions, or stored for future use. Scandinavian descended families applied practical knowledge to maintain efficient production, contributing to regional prosperity and the integration of rural and urban economies. Social organization reflected a balance between inherited northern traditions and European adaptation. Kinship networks remained important for property, inheritance, and loyalty, while civic participation, commercial achievement, and administrative competence became critical to status. Strategic marriages linked families across regions, consolidating influence and fostering stability. Women continued to manage households, trade operations, and estates, playing key roles in maintaining continuity and transmitting knowledge. These networks ensured that communities were resilient, cooperative, and adaptable. Religious institutions were central to community life. Churches, monasteries, and parish networks provided moral guidance, education, and social coordination. Scandinavian descended populations fully embraced Christian practices, contributing to the construction of religious buildings, administration of tithes, and organization of local governance. Former targets of Viking raids had become centers of learning, record-keeping, and spiritual life. Religious institutions strengthened civic cohesion and provided networks that connected communities across regions. Military and security structures had evolved entirely towards civic protection. Trained contingents patrolled towns, rivers, and coasts, ensuring the safety of commerce and residents. Fortifications, once critical to repel sudden raids, were maintained to regulate access, protect property, and demonstrate authority. Leaders relied on strategic planning, diplomacy, and coordination rather than opportunistic aggression. The martial knowledge inherited from northern ancestors was fully adapted to defensive and organizational purposes, contributing to community resilience. Cultural influence remained visible in architecture, material culture, and social practice. Northern-derived craft techniques in shipbuilding, metalwork, and textiles persisted, adapted to local needs and integrated into guild systems. Urban planning and fortification design reflected centuries of experience with maritime settlement and defense. Place names, legal terms, and certain linguistic patterns preserve traces of Scandinavian origin. Communities had become culturally hybrid, blending northern heritage with local customs to produce distinct, enduring identities. Eastern European settlements continued to serve as centers of commerce and administration. Scandinavian descended populations managed trade along rivers, connecting northern Europe with Byzantium, the Islamic world, and distant regions. Administrative, logistical, and navigational expertise enabled these towns to function efficiently, sustaining influence across generations. Cultural hybridization allowed inhabitants to operate effectively within local systems while maintaining practical northern skills. These settlements reflected the long-lasting geographic and economic impact of Viking-era settlement and trade. Population continuity reinforced integration and stability. Children of Scandinavian descent were raised in local languages, civic institutions, and Christian practice. Skills in navigation, trade, and resource management were transmitted through families, apprenticeships, and guild systems. Over generations, identity shifted from one rooted in raiding and mobility to one defined by civic responsibility, commercial competence, and cultural participation. Heritage persisted not through warfare, but through applied expertise, shaping communities and economies for centuries. By the 19th century, the distinct Viking identity had effectively disappeared. Scandinavian influence was still present in place names, linguistic traces, craft traditions, and maritime knowledge, but raiding and mobility were long gone. Communities that had once faced sudden attacks were now centers of culture, governance, and trade. Northern skills had been fully integrated into European systems, influencing shipbuilding, navigation, commerce, urban planning, and legal practices. The legacy of the Viking era remained evident in these practical contributions rather than in any ongoing martial activity. Education and apprenticeship preserved cultural and technical knowledge. Churches, schools, and guilds provided instruction in literacy, trade, administration, and practical skills. Techniques in navigation, shipbuilding, and maritime logistics continued to be taught, ensuring that northern expertise remained active in applied contexts. Communities transmitted knowledge through practical engagement, embedding centuries of experience into daily life, commerce, and governance. Heritage endured in function and practice rather than in identity or martial reputation. Economic systems reflected maturity and integration. Northern ports and river settlements continued to facilitate the movement of goods, connecting rural production with urban markets and international trade. Timber, iron, amber, and furs circulated alongside imported commodities. Scandinavian descended families applied organizational knowledge, logistics, and navigation to maintain efficient trade networks. The combination of historical experience, local adaptation, and civic engagement ensured economic stability and encouraged urban growth and specialization. Governance had become fully institutionalized. Councils, courts, and guilds regulated commerce, administered law, and oversaw infrastructure. Authority was based on competence, civic participation, and reputation rather than solely on inheritance or martial skill. Kinship and marriage networks supported continuity and social cohesion. Scandinavian descended individuals contributed expertise, knowledge, and traditions, shaping communities and maintaining stability within European frameworks. Cultural integration produced resilient hybrid societies. Architecture, urban planning, and fortifications reflected northern experience while serving local needs. Crafts, metalwork, shipbuilding, and textile production blended inherited techniques with local methods. Place names, linguistic traces, and legal practices retained northern influence. Communities represented hybrid identities that combined heritage with full participation in local culture, sustaining continuity while adapting to evolving political, economic, and social conditions. Maritime networks continued to facilitate regional and international connectivity. Ports, rivers, and coastal settlements enabled reliable transport of goods, people, and information. Expertise in navigation, fleet management, and logistical coordination ensured effective movement. These networks supported urban prosperity, regional integration, and sustained practical northern knowledge. Centuries after raiding had ended, maritime skills remained a defining and enduring feature of European development. Military and security functions were entirely integrated into civic life. Trained contingents, fortified towns, and strategic planning ensured protection of commerce, property, and civic order. Northern martial skills were applied in defense, organization, and logistics rather than in attack. Communities had fully transformed from raiding societies into stable, organized, and resilient settlements, demonstrating the adaptability and long-term impact of Viking knowledge and practice. As we reach the final chapter of this long story, it becomes clear that the Viking era, which began with swift raids, unpredictable attacks, and a maritime culture defined by mobility and opportunity, gradually transformed over the course of several centuries into something entirely different. What began as a society driven by the search for wealth, land, and influence through the seas became one deeply embedded in the social, economic, and cultural fabric of Europe. Coastal settlements that had once been targets of raids evolved into thriving towns, ports and riverine communities. Urban centers developed marketplaces, administrative systems, and civic institutions that reflected centuries of adaptation, combining Scandinavian expertise with local traditions. The identity of Scandinavian descended populations shifted profoundly. The traits that had enabled raiding, maritime knowledge, logistical skill, and strategic mobility were redirected into commerce, navigation, governance, and defense. Generations of integration ensured that these communities contributed to trade networks that spanned rivers, coasts, and even international waters. Northern techniques in shipbuilding, navigation, and urban planning became part of the practical skill set of European cities, influencing both economic efficiency and cultural practices. Religious and social integration played a pivotal role in this transformation. Christian institutions offered education, legal oversight, and moral guidance, linking formerly raiding communities into broader networks of European governance and culture. Families continued to transmit practical knowledge, while participation in civic life, trade, and administration reinforced social cohesion. Women remained central in maintaining households, managing estates, and overseeing trade operations, sustaining the continuity of knowledge and stability across generations. The legacy of the Vikings endured, not as a martial identity, but as a foundation of practical skill and cultural contribution. Place names, architectural techniques, craft practices, maritime expertise, and legal frameworks carried traces of northern heritage across centuries. Even in regions far from the Scandinavian homelands, former Viking settlements and their descendants influenced urban planning, trade networks, and governance structures. Over time, the memory of raids faded into history, while the tangible contributions of these communities remained, quietly shaping European development. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the assimilation was complete. Scandinavian descended populations were fully integrated, participating in governance, commerce, and cultural life as European citizens. Their northern ancestry was preserved in subtle ways, through craft, navigation, trade, and linguistic traces, but the raiding identity that once defined them had disappeared entirely. Communities once shaped by fear and mobility had become centers of stability, education, commerce, and cultural continuity. The practical knowledge accumulated over centuries became a lasting legacy, influencing trade, governance, and maritime practice for generations. Looking back, the story of the Vikings is not only one of raids and sudden quests, but also of adaptation, integration, and enduring influence. The transformation from marauders to merchants, settlers, and civic leaders demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human societies to evolve over time. Skills honed for survival and advantage were redirected toward constructive purposes, creating communities that were resilient, prosperous, and culturally rich. The Scandinavian heritage, though no longer defined by the sharp edges of swords or the sudden strike of longships, continues to echo through Europe's towns, legal traditions, maritime practices, and cultural memory. And so, as we end this long journey through centuries of history, it is worth reflecting on the quiet endurance of knowledge, skill, and adaptation. The Vikings, who once moved swiftly across rivers and seas, left behind more than tales of raids. They left a legacy embedded in the very fabric of European life, a reminder that even societies born of upheaval can shape the future in ways that endure far beyond the sword. Thank you for watching and listening to this extended history of how the Vikings raided, settled, and transformed Europe. If you enjoyed this calm historical journey, please like and subscribe to the channel for more immersive stories. Your support helps continue these narratives and allows us to bring history to life in a calm, engaging way. And remember, every small interaction, whether a like, comment, or share, helps keep history alive for others to enjoy. Thank you once again for spending this time exploring the long, fascinating journey of the Vikings. May your curiosity about history continue, And may every story you hear remind you of the enduring impact of those who came before.